Here's a compelling and immersive retelling of the first key moment, crafted to captivate an American audience. The moment was electric. It wasn't just another speech at a high-profile gala, another carefully scripted evening among the nation's most powerful. It was something more, something that no one saw coming. From the front row, a voice cut through the ballroom like a blade, sharp and deliberate. Alexander Reed, the journalist known for bringing politicians to their knees, had stood up. His reputation preceded him, a relentless interrogator, a man who never shied away from uncomfortable truths. His question wasn't just directed at Melania Trump, it was an open challenge, a call for her to prove that she truly understood the struggles of those she claimed to fight for. The room tensed. It wasn't uncommon for powerful figures to be confronted, but this was different. This wasn't a press conference, and Melania Trump wasn't standing behind a podium prepared for battle. She was at a charity event, speaking about children, education, and hope. Yet, in this moment, the conversation had taken a sharp turn. She opened her mouth, poised to respond, her face as composed as ever, but she never got the chance. Because from the same front row, another voice rang out. A voice no one expected to hear. One does not need to suffer in order to understand suffering. The words landed with the weight of something undeniable. And just like that, the entire ballroom froze. Barron Trump had spoken. For years, he had been the silent figure, the child in the background, the son of a president who had never sought the limelight. He had grown up under the public eye, but he had never been a part of the conversation, until now. Heads turned, whispers hushed into silence. Even Alexander Reed, the man known for his unwavering confidence, faltered for the briefest moment. There was something about the way Barron spoke, measured, firm, and utterly unshaken. This wasn't a boy stumbling into a fight that wasn't his. This was a young man stepping forward, unafraid. For the first time that night, it wasn't Melania Trump or even Alexander Reed who held the room in the palm of their hand. It was Barron. The air in the ballroom had changed. It was no longer just another elegant evening among America's elite, it had become something far more intense. The moment Barron Trump's voice cut through the tension, every conversation halted, every set of eyes locked onto him. He had been a silent figure for years, always present but never speaking. Yet here he was, standing toe-to-toe with one of the most feared journalists in the country. Alexander Reed, seasoned and unshakable, recovered quickly. A lifetime in the trenches of hard-hitting journalism had prepared him for unexpected moments, but even he hadn't anticipated this. His sharp eyes narrowed slightly, recalculating. If the young Trump wanted to step into the arena, Reed would not hold back. Lifting the microphone once more, Reed's voice was smooth but edged with challenge. "You say that one does not need to suffer to understand suffering," he echoed, his tone pressing. "But tell me, Barron, do you truly believe that? Do you believe that someone who has never gone hungry, never feared for their future, can truly understand what it means to struggle?" A low murmur rippled through the audience. The weight of the question was undeniable. Reed wasn't just probing, he was attempting to dismantle Barron's argument in real time, to expose a supposed flaw in his logic. The room held its breath, waiting for what would happen next. But Barron did not hesitate. His posture remained steady, his expression unreadable. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of certainty. "Understanding suffering is not about living through it," he said. "It's about what you choose to do when you see it." The simplicity of his response was its greatest strength. It didn't need embellishment, didn't rely on theatrics. It was a truth that cut through the noise, through the political games, through the carefully staged attacks. Reed exhaled slowly through his nose, a subtle, almost imperceptible sign that he was recalibrating. This wasn't a teenager fumbling his way through an argument. This was someone who had come prepared, who had thought deeply about what he was saying. A shift moved through the crowd. Some exchanged glances, others leaned in, intrigued. Barron Trump was not simply defending himself, He was holding his ground in a way no one had expected. But Reed wasn't finished. Turning his gaze back to Melania, he changed tactics. "Mrs. Trump," he said, voice measured but pointed. "You've spoken about helping children, about using your influence for good. But let's talk about reality. Some say that despite your position, you have remained silent when your voice could have made a difference, that you have stood beside a man who has made decisions that have hurt the very children you claim to care about. What do you say to that?" This time, the attack was direct. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation, a demand for accountability. The room tensed once more. Melania Trump, poised as ever, met Reed's gaze. There was no hesitation in her eyes, no uncertainty in her stance. She had heard these criticisms before, had faced the scrutiny of the press time and time again. And when she spoke, her voice was calm but unshakable. "True leadership is not about how loudly you speak," she said. "It is about what you do when no one is watching." The words landed with precision. They weren't defensive, they were defining. A philosophy, a belief, a guiding principle. But just as the audience was absorbing her response, Barron took a step forward once more. His voice cut through the silence. "Is this really about my mother?" he asked, his gaze unwavering. "Or is this about proving your own narrative?" The shift was instant. Reed, the master interrogator, the man who controlled every conversation, had just been put on the defensive. And for the first time that night, it was he who had to find a way to respond. The power had shifted. And the entire room knew it. A sharp silence gripped the room. Barron Trump's words had cut through the air like a blade, forcing even the most seasoned figures in the audience to sit up straighter. He wasn't just defending his mother anymore, he was turning the conversation around, shifting the balance of power in a way that no one had anticipated. Alexander Reed, a man who had built his career on challenging the powerful, was now being challenged himself. His gaze locked onto Barron, studying him, recalculating his next move. The moment had changed, this was no longer just another high-profile interview. It had become a battle of wit, conviction, and presence. But Reed wasn't the type to back down. If Barron wanted to step into the ring, then Reed would make sure he fought for it. He adjusted his stance, tightening his grip on the microphone. His smirk was gone, replaced with something sharper, something calculated. "You ask if this is about proving a narrative," Reed said, his voice controlled but pressing. "But let's be clear, Barron, this is about accountability." The tension thickened. Some guests exchanged uneasy glances, others leaned in, fully engrossed in the unexpected turn of events. "You stand here defending your mother," Reed continued, "but let's not ignore the bigger picture. Your family, your name, holds immense influence in this country. And with influence comes responsibility." He let the words linger, watching their effect. Then, with a deliberate pause, he delivered the strike. "You say your mother doesn't need to use her voice publicly, that her actions should speak for themselves. But history tells us something different. Leaders who remain silent in times of controversy, who choose the background over the front lines, are rarely remembered as champions of change." Then came the final blow. "If your mother truly stands for something, why has she never used her voice to challenge the policies of your father, the very policies that have been criticized for harming the children she claims to care about?" A ripple moved through the audience. This was Reed's trap, his moment. If Barron defended his father, he would be accused of ignoring the struggles of the vulnerable. If he criticized him, the media would feast on it, painting him as the son who turned against his father. It was a no-win scenario. And yet, Barron Trump did not flinch. Instead, he met Reed's gaze with an expression of unwavering certainty. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm, steady, and deliberate. "You assume that the only way to make a difference is through public opposition," he said. "But real change doesn't always happen on a debate stage. It happens in actions most people never see." Reed blinked. Just once. But those watching closely saw it. Barron continued, his voice carrying an undeniable weight. You want my mother to stand against my father in front of cameras. But tell me, he paused, letting the tension rise, is the goal to help people, or is it to create conflict for the sake of a headline? A sharp murmur ran through the audience. Reed exhaled through his nose, his fingers tightening slightly around the microphone. He opened his mouth to press forward, but before he could, Barron delivered the final strike. My mother has never needed to prove her compassion by tearing someone else down, he said, his voice carrying across the ballroom with undeniable conviction. She focuses on solutions, not spectacle. And then, with a piercing gaze, Barron echoed Reed's own words back at him. So tell me, Mr. Reed, what have you personally done to help the children you claim to fight for? The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time that night, Reed stiffened. Subtle, but noticeable. He had spent the entire evening pressing others for accountability, but now the question had been turned on him. And in that fraction of a second, everyone in the room felt it. Barron Trump had just taken control of the conversation. A single clap. Then another. Then, like a wave, the applause swept through the ballroom. Not everyone in the room agreed with Barron Trump. Not everyone in the room was on his side. But they all respected what had just happened. Because Barron Trump hadn't just defended his mother. He had turned the tables on one of the toughest journalists in the country, and he had won. The ballroom, once filled with the gentle hum of diplomatic conversations, now pulsed with an entirely different energy. The applause from Barron Trump's stunning reversal still echoed in the air, but the battle was far from over. Alexander Reed had been cornered in a way he never expected. He had spent his career interrogating presidents, CEOs, and global figures, but tonight, it was a young man, one who had never spoken in public before, who had managed to flip the entire conversation. But Reed was not the kind of journalist to accept defeat easily. He adjusted his tie, took a measured breath, and tightened his grip on the microphone. If challenging Melania Trump's legitimacy hadn't worked, there was only one path forward: go after the head of the family himself. His eyes locked onto Barron, his expression unreadable. And then, with the precision of a seasoned interrogator, he delivered his next attack. You speak of solutions, Barron, Reed said, his voice steady but charged with intent. You speak of action. But let's cut to the real issue here. The room tensed. The audience could feel it coming. For years, your father's administration has been accused of implementing policies that hurt the very children your mother claims to care about, he continued. And there it was. Even those who had been sipping their wine just moments ago were now frozen in place. Reed had played his final card. This was no longer about Melania. This was no longer about Barron's words or principles. This was about Donald Trump. Reed leaned forward slightly, his tone measured, but with an undeniable sharpness. You talk about compassion, about real change. But what do you say to the families separated at the border because of your father's immigration policies? To the children who lost educational support when funding was cut? To those who struggled under an administration that, according to critics, prioritized the wealthy over the working class? The trap had been set. If Barron defended his father, he would be labeled as blind to suffering. If he criticized him, the media would turn it into a political spectacle, the son turning against the father. The entire room waited. Would he crumble? Would he retreat? But Barron didn't do either. He took a step forward. His voice remained calm, but this time, there was something heavier in his tone. Something unshakable. You're asking me to answer for policies I did not create, he said, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. But let me ask you this, do you truly want solutions, or just someone to blame? Reed's expression flickered, just for a second. He had not expected that response. And Barron wasn't finished. You ask about immigration, about education, about wealth gaps, he continued. But standing here and debating policies from the past does nothing for the children who are struggling right now. His gaze swept across the room, landing on those who had sat quietly until now, those who had watched the exchange unfold without taking sides. If we care about these issues, then let's focus on what can be done today, not on using the past to score political points. Reed's jaw tightened. Barron had just refused to play the game. But the journalist pressed forward. That sounds like an easy way to avoid accountability, he countered. Your family held power. You say we should focus on action, but what action has been taken to fix the damage? It was a risky move. Reed was doubling down, trying to push Barron into a corner. But once again, Barron didn't flinch. You want to talk about accountability? He asked, his voice unwavering. Then let's talk about all of us. Because no single government, no single person, can fix everything alone. Then came the strike that changed everything. If you truly care about these children, Mr. Reed, then tell me, aside from asking questions on a stage, what have you personally done to help them? The room held its breath. Reed opened his mouth, but for the first time that night, he hesitated. And in that fraction of a second, Barron knew. He had just taken control of the conversation. A sharp murmur ran through the audience. Some looked at Reed, waiting for his response. Others turned to Barron, realizing they were witnessing something no one had predicted. Then, a single clap. Then another. And then, like a rolling wave, the applause spread across the room. Barron Trump had done something extraordinary. He had stood his ground. He had rejected the trap. He had turned the challenge back onto the questioner. And Alexander Reed, the man known for breaking the world's most powerful figures, had no answer. Because tonight, Barron Trump had just redefined the game. The ballroom was still humming with energy from Barron Trump's stunning response. What had started as an attempt to corner him into defending his mother had now transformed into something else entirely. He wasn't just holding his own, he was controlling the conversation, dictating its pace, forcing one of the most seasoned journalists in the country onto the defensive. But Alexander Reed was not done yet. He had spent years perfecting his craft, had faced the most powerful figures in America, and had never been outmaneuvered so easily. If politics hadn't worked, if challenging Melania's legitimacy hadn't worked, there was one last card to play. He would put the Trump name itself on trial. Reed adjusted his stance, his grip tightening around the microphone. His voice, though calm, carried an undeniable sharpness. He knew that this was his last move, his final shot. Barron, he began, his words deliberate. You've defended your mother's actions. You've argued that leadership doesn't always require words, that true influence comes from action. He paused, letting the moment stretch, allowing the weight of his next words to settle over the audience. But let's talk about the bigger picture. A shift moved through the room. Everyone knew where this was going. You say your mother doesn't need to make speeches to prove she cares, Reed continued, his gaze steady. But what about your father? And there it was. A few guests exchanged uneasy glances. A handful of journalists leaned forward, pens hovering over their notepads, waiting. Even those who had begun to admire Barron's poise were now cautious, because this question was different. This wasn't about empathy anymore. This was about power. About legacy. About whether the Trump family had earned its place in history, or stolen it. Reed's expression hardened. Your father built his empire on his name. He became president on that name. And that name, Trump, has divided this country like no other. The energy in the room shifted once more. This was no longer about one family, it was about America itself. Reed leaned in slightly, his voice now sharpened to a point. So tell me, Barron, with all the controversy, the scandals, the division, does the Trump name deserve to be remembered with respect? Silence. Dead silence. This was the moment Reed had been waiting for all night. The question no one could avoid. The moment that could either destroy Barron or define him forever. A single wrong move, and it was over. A single hesitation, and the world would call him a fraud. But Barron Trump didn't hesitate. He didn't flinch. He didn't falter. Instead, he stepped forward. His voice was steady, unwavering, as he delivered the words that would change everything. "You want to talk about my last name?" he asked, his presence filling the room. "You want to ask if my family deserves respect?" He let the question hang in the air, holding every eye in the ballroom. Then, with deliberate precision, he answered. "A name is not an identity." Reed blinked. This was not the answer he had expected. A name is not a birthright. A name is not a guarantee of power. And a name, no matter how famous or infamous, does not define who you are. The crowd stirred. A low murmur moved through the guests. Barron wasn't playing defense anymore. He was rewriting the narrative. "My father's name didn't make him who he was," Barron continued. "His choices did." More murmurs. Some nods. Journalists scribbled furiously, realizing the weight of what was happening. And then, Barron delivered the final blow. "And I will not be defined by my father's name either." A shift. A realization. People weren't just watching Barron Trump anymore. They were listening. "I will be defined by my own choices," he declared. "By my own actions. By the way I treat people. By the things I build. By the impact I leave behind." The room was holding its breath. Even Reed, so precise, so methodical, seemed momentarily thrown off balance. Because Barron had just done something no one had expected. He had broken free. He had stepped outside the Trump shadow and declared himself his own man. The applause started slowly, hesitant at first. Then another. Then another. And then, like a crashing wave, the entire ballroom erupted. People stood. Journalists scribbled furiously, trying to capture the magnitude of the moment. Even some of Reed's biggest supporters nodded in quiet approval. Because Barron Trump had just won. Not by defending his father. Not by rejecting his father. But by proving that he was more than just a name. He was a legacy of his own. And the world would never see him the same way again. Reed exhaled slowly. He had nothing left to say. He had lost. Not because Barron had argued harder. But because Barron had spoken the truth. And the truth had won. The room was still vibrating with energy, the echoes of thunderous applause rolling through the grand ballroom like a wave that refused to die down. This wasn't just polite clapping, the kind reserved for charity speeches or well-rehearsed political statements. This was something deeper, something rare. It was the sound of people realizing they had just witnessed a moment that mattered. Alexander Reed still held the microphone in his hand, but he had no words left to fill it. He had walked into the night expecting a battle he was certain to win. Instead, he had found himself standing across from a young man who had not only met his challenges but had turned them into something greater. Barron Trump had not argued. He had not played Reed's game. He had spoken the truth. And in doing so, he had done what few could, he had taken control of the moment without ever needing to raise his voice. But the most powerful part of the night wasn't the applause, nor was it the silent acknowledgement from those who had underestimated him. It was the way Barron himself stood there, still composed, still steady, watching the reaction unfold, not with arrogance, not with victory in his eyes, but with something quieter. Something deeper. Because for him, this was never about winning. This was about standing up. About protecting his mother. About proving, without needing to shout, without needing to insult, that he was more than just a name. And then, as the applause reached its peak, Melania Trump stepped forward. She didn't say much, she didn't need to. She simply reached out, adjusting the lapel of her son's suit, a small, tender gesture, the kind only a mother would understand. Barron gave her a slight nod, a silent exchange between them. No grand words, no theatrics. Just quiet understanding. And then, in a moment that sealed the night, Melania took the microphone one final time. Doing the right thing never requires justification. With that, she set the microphone down and walked off the stage. The reaction was immediate. Journalists scrambled to rewrite their headlines. Guests whispered among themselves, realizing they had just witnessed something historic. Social media exploded. Clips of the exchange began circulating within minutes, spreading far beyond the ballroom, reaching audiences across the world. Because tonight had not been about politics. It had been about something bigger. A moment of courage. A moment of truth. A moment where one young man, who had been underestimated for years, stood in front of the world and refused to break. Some in the audience still had their doubts. Because Barron Trump had not given them the answer they expected. He had given them something they weren't ready for. A version of the Trump legacy that was not about division, but about choice. About integrity. About standing for something beyond a name. Alexander Reed exhaled slowly, the weight of the night settling on him. He had come here expecting an easy target. He had expected a fight. Instead, he had met something else entirely. A young man who refused to be boxed in. A young man who had forced even the sharpest critics to listen. And for the first time in his career, Reed realized. Maybe he had underestimated the wrong Trump.